I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. Recently, a member of our local Knitters Guild asked me if there was a way to eliminate the smell from musty yarn. She'd been given a large quantity of vintage yarn and really wanted to avoid throwing it out. There were multiple sweater quantities of this yarn, but it was so smelly she had to keep it stored in plastic bins with tight lids. So I've always just thrown out yarn that smelled musty, but I had a couple of ideas that I thought might work. So I asked her for one of the skeins, did some research to see if any of my ideas were plausible, and came up with an experiment to see what would actually work. There are several challenges to overcome in order to get rid of the musty smell. From what I understand, I'm not an expert, the smell is a byproduct of the mold spores. So the first challenge is to kill the mold spores that create the smell, but also do something to get rid of that smell. You have to do both. There are quite a few things that can kill mold, but not all of them are going to work in a given situation. For example, bleach works great on ceramic tile, but it would harm wool. So I had to find a process that would kill the mold and get rid of the smell, but without harming the wool. I wanted to use products and equipment that I had already in the house, and I didn't want the process to be labor intensive. So there are a few things that I learned about how to kill mold that I thought had potential. There are special devices that can be used to disinfect rooms or items using UV light, but I read repeatedly that taking advantage of natural sunlight outdoors could do the trick. 1 to 2 hours in the direct sun was supposed to be enough, but you do have to make sure that the sun hits all of the parts of the musty item, so you'd have to turn it or rotate it. We use a solution of vinegar and Dawn dish detergent at home that we spray onto our shower tiles to kill mildew. And that viscosity of the detergent helps the vinegar cling to the shower walls so that it can do its work. The dish detergent helps to actually clean the tiles as we scrub them, and then we could just rinse them off and they're fine. I wasn't going to be able to scrub yarn because that would be a disaster, but I could place it in a container to soak. So this idea of vinegar sounded promising. Mold spores will die at temperatures colder than -70 Celsius or hotter than 70 Celsius. A home freezer can make the mold cold enough to go dormant, but it won't kill the spores. It's very easy to heat water to a high enough temperature to kill the spores, so this seemed like another promising idea. I had a 4-ounce hank to experiment with, so I divided it into 4 mini hanks. And I labeled each one of them, skein 1, skein 2, skein 3, and skein 4. I kept one as a control, and then I tried something different with each of the other 3. If you're going to try something similar at home, hank up the yarn so that you've got these big loops like this, and then tie it in a couple of places with figure-8 ties. Don't try to eliminate the smell out of a ball of yarn that's intact as a ball or a commercially wound skein. Turn it into hanks. Skein number 1 was to try fresh air and sunshine. Although I had read repeatedly that 1 to 2 hours in the sun would be enough to kill the spores as long as I rotated the item so that the UV light would kill the spores, the problem was that I live in Minnesota, and I did this experiment in January when the angle of the sun is at its lowest and the UV index is 1. So I tried putting the hank on a roof in the January sunshine and rotated it every hour or over the course of 5 hours, which is about as much direct sun as our roof gets in the winter. Obviously, if it was early July, the UV index would be much higher, but I wasn't going to wait 6 months to do that experiment. One thing to keep in mind is that dyed yarn may be light sensitive and the sun might cause some fading. My yarn appears to be a natural color, so I wasn't worried about it. For the second skein, I used vinegar and Dawn dish detergent. I really had no idea how much vinegar would be needed to kill the mold spores in the wool. So I filled a plastic tub with the hottest tap water we had, squirted some Dawn dish detergent into it, and then dumped in a few glugs of vinegar. I let it sit for an hour, and then I went on the roof, rotated my yarn that was sitting under the UV light, and I dumped out the tub full of vinegar and Dawn water, and then filled the tub up again in order to rinse off the soap and vinegar and the mold spores. The idea here was to kill the mold with the vinegar and then wash the yarn with the soap and water. So I let it sit in the rinse water for another hour when I went back up to the roof to rotate my rooftop skein. For this third skein, I just used very hot water. I know from dyeing wool as well as scouring wool fleece that wool can take extremely hot temperatures provided that you're not agitating the wool when it's hot. When you're dyeing wool, the water gets to just below simmering. It doesn't felt as long as you're just letting it sit in the hot water. This is the pot that I use. I have this big pasta pot. I use this for scouring wool and for dyeing wool, but any large pot would do. And the reason that I have this particular one is that it's got a lid, but it has a steamer basket insert, and it also has this big colander insert. So I filled up the pot with water and I tossed the yarn in, and I just heated it until it got up to 165. The temperature range that will kill mold spores is between 140 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 60 to 70 degrees Celsius. And so I let it go just a little bit higher than that, and then I just turned off the heat. And then I let it cool down alone. I didn't want to disturb the wool while it was that hot because I didn't want to felt it. And I just let it cool down over the course of the day. Once it was just tepid, then I was able to dump out the water and not worry that the yarn was going to felt. If you're planning on doing something like this at home, I would recommend putting something on the bottom of the pot, like just a steamer basket or something, so that your wool isn't just sitting on the bottom of the pan next to the heat source. I am lucky to have this colander thing, but if you don't have something like that, that would be what I would recommend, is like a steamer basket. The results were really interesting. The skein that sat out in the sunshine all afternoon barely smelled any different. If I managed to kill the mold spores in the weak January sunshine, I did nothing to wash the smell away. A better test would be to wash the wool first and then put it out into the sun, preferably when the UV index is high enough to give you a sunburn, because then you know that that UV light is really doing something. The skein that I soaked in Dawn and vinegar was a lot better, like incredibly a lot better, but you could still smell a little bit of mustiness underneath. I might have needed more vinegar, but I have no idea what sort of ratio of vinegar to yarn would be needed. The skein I heated to 165 degrees Fahrenheit smells like wool. The high temperature killed the mold spores, and the amount of water it was sitting in was enough to just wash away the smelliness. I didn't use any soap at all. In this pot of hot water, it took the most elapsed time from the time I started heating the water to the time when it was cool enough to dump out, but it took the least amount of effort in supervised time. I did try a fourth experiment with the 3 ounces that I had that still smelled. And what I did this time was soak them in hot tap water for 20 minutes, long enough to saturate the wool so that all the air was gone. And then I put them in the steamer basket of my pot rather than submerging them in water. So there was water in the pot, but it was just creating steam. And I set a timer for 20 minutes. I had no idea if I needed that much time or if that would be long enough. So after 20 minutes, I lifted the lid and all I could smell was hot, wet wool. I turned off the heat and took the lid off, and I could then pull the steamer basket out without disturbing the wool itself, which had allowed it to cool a little bit faster. And because it wasn't immersed in the hot water as those spores were killed, I wanted to wash it afterwards. Once it was cool enough to handle, I washed it in unicorn fiber wash, and I saw a lot of discolored water pour out of that pan. I then rinsed it in unicorn fiber rinse. You could use whatever you normally use to wash your woolens, whether it's shampoo or some sort of wool wash. I just happen to use the unicorn products personally. This fourth experiment did work, but it took the most hands-on effort of all three of them. I just don't know that steaming was worth the effort. I might as well have just thrown the wool in the water, heated it up, and then let it sit there. Many of you are going to wonder whether this would work with other fibers. My guess is that many fibers can withstand the 160+ degree water temperature. But if you have a lot of yarn to deal with, try it on a small amount first, just to make sure. Especially with synthetics, you can kill acrylic if it gets too hot, and then it's not going to be good to knit with. On the other hand, you may have nothing to lose by just trying it on your full batch of yarn. You can't use the yarn if it's musty, so you won't be any worse off if you ruin it by cooking it in hot water. Well, that's it for this week's Technique Tuesday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.